My name is Bridget Choi, a Director of Incident Response here at Booz Allen Hamilton. And today we're going to discuss data ethics and why do we need it. And what I intend to do today is provide some foundational knowledge to frame further discussion with our panelists after my keynote. And a little bit about me. I was an attorney for 9 years here in New York City. After that, I pivoted in-house to an insurance company where I handled data privacy and cyber claims for about 8 years. After that, I was general counsel at a cyber consulting company, and now I handle the incident response for Booz Allen. So let's begin, and let me give you a little outline about what I'm going to talk about. So first, I'm going to start talking about what actually is data ethics. I'm going to pivot a little to why entities and people should care. And then I'm going to weave that into the top principles of data ethics and put a framework around it. And then I'm going to give you some examples of gross violations of data ethics and then compare it to good intentions gone awry and how mismanagement of data can have a negative impact. And then we're going to go into how it's actually implemented, how institutions can implement data privacy ethics, and offer an argument as to why data ethics can be a competitive advantage to enterprises who do it well. Next slide. So to begin, when people and data-driven technologies intersect, there are competing interests. There's interest in innovation, the societal benefits, and that is put against things like demands of privacy and individual autonomy. And sometimes that can cause a conflict. The misuse of data and data-driven technologies lie at the heart of some of the most challenging issues, like, for example, government surveillance, political manipulation, the use of data to exert power over individuals, like in school situations or in employment situations. The challenges of managing the risk include not only violations of privacy, but also issues like bias, manipulation, misinformation, the idea of the opaque black box decision-making. There can be further entrenchment in inequality when data applied to AI is misused. There could be undermining of democracy, among many other potential harms. So let's unpack this concept of privacy a little bit. And let's think about the quantum of consumer data available. So almost 300 million Americans have a smartphone, or roughly 85% of people in America. Now think about that. All the apps that exist on phones that can track behavior, locations, money flow, we are at the point that anonymized data can be de-anonymized through all the other data flows that can be collected. And predictive algorithms can advise on the complex to the mundane. So I could know when to order dog food based on using an app, right? That's the way that predictive algorithms have made our lives more efficient. And we also know more about health patterns. We can not just identify genetic markers, but we can, through AI, test patterns of behavior and predict future diseases and treat diseases better, right? There are fitness wearables that have alone purportedly have generated more than 28 petabytes of data. And if you think about that in perspective, the first smartwatch came to market in 2012, right? So with the growth of computing power, so has spurred the growth of aggregated data, right? What we know about human behavior and corporate behavior, etc. And the data and computer power mutually reinforce each other and increase the speed and capacity of things it can do, which leads us to our need for an ethical framework for collecting, storing, and using that information. So let's think about it for a moment. What actually is data ethics? Now, on the screen, you can see data ethics refers to systemizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong in relation to data. But that term can be obtuse, right? You may have wondered, what does this actually mean? And how do organizations achieve data ethics on the ground? Now, in past, organizations whose use of data posed risks sought to address this by complying with privacy laws and fair information practices, right? And that's historically was enough. But we are at a point now with advanced analytics and AI that this strategy is insufficient. Now, for one thing, with advanced analytics and AI, the risks that are posed go far beyond privacy risks. We talked before about bias and manipulation, for example. For another, privacy law central tools are notice, consent, and purpose limitation. They don't protect those people who can understand what data scientists can infer from their data. So if you can't make a meaningful choice about what sharing this data will do in the first place, how can you actually meaningfully consent? Now, that's not to say privacy law isn't important. Privacy law remains vital, and I would argue essential to data ethics, but it does not protect people from all the harms data can create. So to reduce the risk, companies need to go beyond just privacy and FIPs. They have to try to spot bias and fix it. They have to distinguish between persuasion and exploitation, right? How they're getting that information, how they're using that information, and they have to be stewards of ethics and stop themselves from engaging in exploitation. They have to find ways to make their algorithms more explainable and less opaque, right? We talked about before the black box of understanding how algorithms come to their decision. They need to be able to unpack that more. And they have to take other steps that privacy law just doesn't require yet. Now, to think about data ethics is really to go beyond what is legally required to reduce the risk to individuals and the broader society. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now that you have an understanding of what I believe data ethics is, let's talk about some of the three key principles and put that into the three phases of data. Okay, so the first principle is first and foremost minimizing the risk of harm in the use and the output of information, right? So that's a key term in making sure everything you do within the three phases of data is working toward minimizing the harm. Now, principle number two, obtaining informed consent. That's volition, purposefully giving information with knowledge of what it's going to do versus acquiescence, versus getting someone to click through a privacy statement, which we all do right now. And what I'm going to unpack that a little bit further because I think this point is super important. Think about what you have to do when you're engaging in, for example, a health study, a scientific study. When you go into a scientific study, they tell you what they're going to collect from you, how long they're going to keep that information, what thesis they're trying to prove or theorem, what the extent of the information they're trying to extract that you're giving them. And ultimately, they provide you with the result. And there's an ending point, there's a beginning point, there's transparency. Right now, with the way that data is collected, that does not exist. There is no volition in giving it over. There's no informed consent. Mostly, the way that information is given, it's through acquiescence or just, unknown. Principle number 3, protecting the anonymity and the privacy of data subjects. That goes from information security, that goes back to how we're categorizing information, how we are anonymizing it, and trying to prevent de-anonymization of information. So let's put that into the 3 phases of data and how that actually will work in reality. So let's think about data acquisition. What is that, and what does that actually mean? Data acquisition is really how information is collected. So we think about informed consent. It's not just informed consent. It's the creation of information, right? So gathering information from maybe your employees, maybe things you're observing in the market. Maybe it's through other means. You have some sort of AI that just broadly collects information. That's creation of data. What about given? So how is that information given to you? You might have a commercially facing portal where people give you information. You might transact. You might be a transactional organization. People give you information, they give you money, and data can be extrapolated from that. So how are we acquiring that information? And then the third way, which is an important thing to note, is many companies purchase information, right? So are we comfortable with purchasing information from sources that may not have gathered it in the most ethical way? And how are we coming to a point of reality that maybe some of the places that are gathering this information are not doing it through ethical means? And then do we want it? Are we going to continue to purchase that information? The next phase of data is data processing and protection. And I would break that down to a bunch of things. I would think about data aggregation, data analysis, how we store that information, how we dispose and how long we keep that information, and how we anonymize it, how we take the data subject's identifiable information and make it unknowable. So that goes to the heart of privacy, right? So having principles of least privilege, not letting people who don't need that information access that information, make it unidentifiable if we're aggregating it to the end user, making sure that we're not keeping it longer than we need it, right? And then how we're analyzing it. Are we doing that in an ethical way to reduce harm? And lastly, the other tenet or phase of data that you want to think about is the use of data and the intent. So what are we doing with it? Are we monetizing it? Are we reusing it? Are we sharing it? Right? And what ethical obligations do we have in those 3 things? How are we making money off of this information? Are we doing a study? Are we making better investments? Are we changing our corporate behavior? Are we analyzing fraud within our own corporation or broadly? Are we reusing it, right? Are we taking it for its original purpose and using it for something else? And is that ethical? And lastly, sharing it. So are we taking this information, giving it to a credit rating agency and reselling it? And is that okay? These are the questions that you have to ask when you think about data. So it's not just, most people focus on the middle part. Most people think about that because that's traditional privacy framework. But the things that people have to broaden their horizon on is how we get it and how we use it. Now, let's put this into context. Next slide, please. Let's talk about how things have gone wrong. So I'm going to discuss quickly the most obvious one, the most nefarious one, Cambridge Analytica. But it hits a lot of the notes that we just discussed. So let's think about Cambridge Analytica, a voter profiling company, access data of about 50 million Facebook users. And in June 2014, a researcher called Alex Kogan developed a personality quiz for Facebook. And it was heavily influenced by a similar personality quiz made by Psychometric Center, a Cambridge University laboratory where Kogan had worked. And about 300,000 people installed the personality quiz app on their Facebook account. But as with many Facebook developers at the time, Kogan could access the data about not just the users who downloaded their app, but also their friends. And when Kogan's app asked for that data, it saved that information on a private database instead of immediately deleting it. And Kogan provided that private database containing information about 50 million Facebook users. So look at the quantum of data, 300,000 versus 50 million, that's a lot more power. And it used it to create voter profiles for a company, Cambridge Analytica. Now, Cambridge Analytica took that information and used it to make 3 million psychographic profiles about voters. Right? So let's think about that in the framework that we just discussed. Okay? And if you don't mind, Gabe, could you just go back to the previous slide? How did they acquire the data? Well, first, they had an app where you were doing a personality quiz. You know, are you a sad person, a happy person, an introvert, an extrovert? And that was what, if you downloaded the app, thought you were going to get a little information about your personality. Did you know that that information was going to be aggregated? Did you know that it was going to be used for voter profiles? No, that was not disclosed. That's the first volition versus acquiescence. Yes, these people purposely gave over information about their personality, but they did not know, it was not informed consent, that it would go to voter profiles. So that is the first ethical breach. Then we go to the data processing protection, right? Facebook allowed not just those who consented to give over their information, access to that information, but it also gave access to their friends. Did their friends consent to the data acquisition? No. Is that a proper way to protect user profiles? No. Is that a proper way to gather information by taking it off the platform and putting it into a private server? No. That's a vast ethical breach. What about use and intent? How is it used? So, right, there was, you know, if this was for money, if someone gave over money, for example, and not information, we would say, you know, if this is fraud by trickery, you know, there's a whole bunch of criminal behaviors that you could prosecute this under. So if someone said, you know, give me $1 and you're going to get this, and you realized, you know, you didn't get what you want, you would have a right to say something about it. But because it's just information, you have no right. So that's the essence of the fraud here. Now, if we look to the principles that we discussed, right? We talked about minimizing the risk of harm. That's a huge harm. that is influence in an election. That could be used. There is no informed consent about the intent and purpose of the study. The anonymity and the privacy of the data subjects was breached, right? So all of the key tenets here were hit, and that's why this was a huge scandal. Not just the harm, but in each step of the way, there was an ethical breach. Now let's take that for a minute and put that to. And if you could go to the next slide, I'm sorry. Let's put that in the context of unintended consequences. Let's put that to an insider threat type program. So a couple of years ago, a California employee sues her employer, claiming she was fired 2 weeks after turning off company GPS app. And the app tracked her movements while she was on the clock and off the clock. And the plaintiff likened the app to wearing a parolee's bracelet. And called it illegal and asked for $500,000 in compensation for wrongful termination. Now, they had asked their employees that as a condition of employment, that they would put this on their phone. They were clear about its intent and purposes. It was part of their insider threat program. This is a money service business where cash flowed through the employees. They felt it was necessary for how they operate. And they told their employees that it would be for while they're at work and off work. But so there's not necessarily an ethical breach in the first two phases, but in the harm, in that the employees felt that it was akin to a parolee's ankle bracelet, that they felt like they were under a continuous, and they were under a continuous state of surveillance, and they felt uncomfortable with that. So while the intent was to keep an insider threat program going, the unintended consequence was that the employees felt suffocated by it. And now you have a wrongful termination suit on your hands. So those are the two things to think about: unintended consequences, the quantum of harm that could be caused by all these new technologies, and how do we minimize the risk of that harm. Now, I'm going to put forth one more example, and I came across it recently, and I thought it was pretty interesting because it gives you one more perspective. What about the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles reportedly had been earning millions of dollars reselling Florida drivers' personal information to third-party companies, including bill collectors, insurance companies, and data brokers. And what we understood was the Florida residents started complaining because they started getting robocalls, right? They started getting solicitations in the mail. And they didn't understand how they could be on that list. Now, if we look at the benefit to the Florida DMV, they earned purportedly $77 million off of that deal. That's a lot of money. But what's the harm? And if you go back to the framework, they did not get the consent of those who gave their information. They did not. They were not clear and transparent about how they were using that information, and they caused harm to those of their constituents. Next slide, please. I'm going to wrap up really quickly. So just really quickly, what I offer to you is you can build a successful data ethics use program. And it is a And it's an advantage to your company, not just because negative business ramifications of the misuse of data is large. It's because if you are more ethical than your competitors, that's something that people are drawn to. And I would offer it in 3 ways. You have to understand what your beliefs are and codify it. You have to take an accounting of the data you have, where it's coming from, and who owns it, so that there's ownership behind the data. There can be risk mitigation when you're measuring it, and there's people and roles for that data ownership. There has to be change management. It has to come from the C-suite down to the lowest person in the corporation. It has to be part of the culture. It can't just be a platitude that you put on a website. And lastly, I would argue that you've codified it, you've identified what you have, you've put it into the fabric of your corporation. You have to test it, because there are going to be things that you can't see because you love your product and you think it's great. So I would say test it internally, but also retain an outside auditor, a specialist in the data, and get a finding and then adjust to the findings. So to sum up, ethical data practices are going to be a competitive advantage to those who follow them. And there aren't many who are doing it well. So if you are a leader, you will be one with a leg up, one who is gaining the trust of your partners, and you can go to market with how ethical you are. And that is something that will inure in your favor as the privacy and data protection laws continue to evolve with the technology.